Ms. Champa, you can start your welcome remark.
Okay, thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am Champa Liyanage, President of Sri Lanka Institute of Landscape Architects. On behalf of SRILA, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to IFLA Talk and Share event, October 2025. We commence today's Talk and Share event by remembering Professor Kim Jun-yu. His remarkable contributions and lasting legacy continue to inspire our professional community. May he rest in eternal peace. At the outset, I wish to thank IFLA APR presidents, secretaries, and executive councils, with special thanks to Pamela Pagana, Soban Kumar, and the team for their determination. Again, a special thanks should goes to our country delegate Priyanka Ranatunga, IFLA APR Communications and External Relations Committee Chair, and his team. We are deeply honored that SRILA has been given the privilege of hosting this event. We also extend our heartfelt appreciation to our eminent speakers and moderator for graciously accepting our invitation to participate this session. We would like to acknowledge SRILA Council members, immediate past president and secretary for their unwavering dedication and valuable contribution to the success of this talk and share session. Talk and Share is a platform for exchanging professional experience and expertise in landscape architecture, and also an opportunity for learning and sharing knowledge across the world. Allow me to briefly introduce about SRILA. SRILA is the only professional body for landscape architects in Sri Lanka, incorporated under Parliament Act number 33 of 2009. The main pathway for membership is through BLA Honours Degree Program of University of Moratuwa, Sri Lanka. In addition to IFLA APR membership, SRILA is a proud member of Organization of Professional Associations of Sri Lanka. Before we proceed, let me briefly introduce our beautiful island, Sri Lanka, famous as the pearl of the Indian Ocean, blessed with many natural and man-made landscapes, golden beaches, misty mountains, forest reserves, tea plantations, paddy fields, ancient temples, sacred gardens, and heritage sites. We warmly invite you all to visit and experience its vibrant landscapes, unique tradition, and warm hospitality. Our speakers, veteran in the subject, will discuss today on our famous heritage sites by paying special attention to Anuradhapura and Sigiriya. Let us turn to our main focus today, heritage management and landscape architecture. Let me now introduce our distinguished speakers and the moderator. Speaker one, so that I think she has to take, she will be the second speaker today. So landscape architect Mrs. Sharina Amendra. She will talk about enhancing the palimpsest in historically religious landscapes with reference to Anuradhapura. She is a chartered architect and chartered landscape architect, fellow member of SRILA and SLIA, and also founder member of and past president of SRILA, the current president of Royal Asiatic Society of Sri Lanka. She is having over 14 years of teaching experience and served as a senior consultant at University of Moratuwa and an award-winning professional and author of Beyond the Seeing Eye Mahatupa of Sri Lanka. Our speaker two, architect Ashley DeVos, he will talk about Is There Another Version, a story for Sigiriya. He is renowned chartered architect and a fellow member of SLIA and also recipient of national honors Deshamanya Vidya Jyoti Jatika Uruma Prasad Brahma. He is a multiple award-winning professional in design and heritage and also having extensive teaching experience locally and internationally. He is the managing director of Ashley Divorce Consultants. His expertise span in architecture, landscape architecture, conservation, and archaeology. Our moderator today is Professor Mrs. Shirani Balasuriya, Chartered Architect and Chartered Landscape Architect and fellow member of SLIA and SLILA. She also a founder member as and present president of past president of SLILA and currently served as senior consultant at University of Moratuwa, Sri Lanka. She is the pioneer of MSc in Landscape Design program at University of Moratuwa, Sri Lanka, and she is a consultant in architecture and landscape architecture both locally and internationally. With great pleasure, I now hand over the session to our moderator, Professor Mrs. Chirani Balasuriya, to conduct the October Talk and Share session. Over to you, Madam.
Thank you, President of the Sri Lanka Institute of Landscape Architects. Greetings from Sri Lanka. I have the great privilege and honor to be the moderator of two of my good friends, colleagues, and fellow professionals. To start this talk and share, I invite Deshamani Vidya Jyoti Ashley Divorce on his very fascinating journey of a 1982 World Heritage Site of Sigiriya. And you will now see the mysteries unfold in his title, Is There Another Version? A Story in Sigiriya. Over to you, Architect Ashley.
Yeah, hi.
We can hear you.
You can hear me or not?
Yes, we can.
Okay, that's great. So basically, I wish to thank both institutes for having invited me. Also, Sri Lanka Institute, especially for the courage to to allow me to speak on a very controversial subject. It's a subject that has been sort of yeah. So I'm going through a lot of material. I hope we have the time to do it, but I'll quickly go through it so that we can sort of fire off as we go along. So basically, Sigiriya. Sigiriya is very interesting in the sense that geologically it's part of a major change that took place millions of years ago, and it left the island with three peneplains, low, flat peneplains, and Sigiriya is on the lowest peneplain. So it's quite interesting. As far as the landscape in Sri Lanka is concerned, it's very sensitive and totally Buddhist oriented. So it's a very sensitive landscaping and an attitude towards landscaping where it involved nature and environment as a very important part of that. And we go back to the 3rd century BC when Arhat Mahinda, who met King Devanampiyatissa at Nisaka Mountain, makes a statement to him where he says, not only man, but animals in the forest, birds in the air, and the fish in the water, the trees in the forest, all have a right to live. So it was a very interesting statement, and a lot of what we have done since has been based on that, and which also led to, for example, the creation of a say, for example, a secluded area where between Misaka Mountain and Anuradhapura, where we had a situation where Uyana was created. Uyana in the sense that the Sri Lankan attitude towards living in harmony with the environment, and so on, which is very, very important. Now, the Uyana concept is different to the Udyana. Now, Uyana, in our understanding, is actually a large protected area. And that was possibly the first real protected area anywhere in the world, which was declared in the 3rd century BC. So we are it's interesting that we are sort of part of that heritage, and therefore I think you'll find that a lot of the attitudes that you see was very different. But we have a Uyana, which is a forest which comes down. It's a protected forest, and no animals are allowed to be killed in it, and so on. But within that, there is a possibility of having specialized areas with its own SEMA. SEMA means its own boundary, and so on. And the first one I would like to introduce you to is the one in the Maguluyana, which is this one, which is a highly stylized area made by a king, and it's on the bank of a huge tank, and so on. And it's a very interesting landscape. But within this Uyana, the large Uyana, is a huge space, which is a forest. And within the forest, you have these little specialized areas which are which becomes part of it. Now, for example, the other one I would like to introduce you to is this one, which is further down, which is another specialized area within this huge parkland, or I would refer to as a forest actually, rather than anything else. So you have this specialized area within this forest, which is highly, which is worked very differently. This place is very interesting in the sense that you have you have the rocks here almost looking like elephants coming to the edge of the tank, and then you have carvings of elephants here, which is on this side and so on, which shows that though it's part of a larger landscape. Then I would take you again to to Anuradhapura, for example, where we have the first stupa in Anuradhapura built in 247 BC. And the reason I'm doing that is to show you the sensitivity that came into the being of that. For example, the stupa has the collarbone relic of the Buddha. It was kept on an elephant. The elephant was brought up to the site, but it refused to bend down or lower itself till the base of the stupa was raised to a certain level, which the elephant thought was the proper height for the stupa. So it's about 2 meters above the existing ground. And the sacred relic was initially covered in lumps of clay, which were brought from one of the tanks. And the layer of bricks that was laid on top as a protection, and a simple roof was done over it. But then over time, different kings came and added what we refer to as the Vatadage, which is a roof structure on columns covering the whole thing. Now, the stupa that you see is not the original shape. The original shape would have been a much more simple one. This is a change that has taken over time, and it's very, very different. Now, what is also important is that the early monasteries would have been out of mud and earth. So it's actually upholding the concept of impermanence, because the whole thinking in Buddhism is that life and everything is impermanent, and therefore you can't have these structures and so on. But the kings thought they had to go on an ego trip, and they started without using mud and earth, they went into stone. So that change did take place. But, for example, there were the Puranagamas, that was the houses of the ordinary people, the farmers, which the British referred to as, they said they were republics, farming republics. They, for example, were all in earth, and they existed till about till about 20, 30 years ago, when suddenly somebody decided that it's infra dig to live in mud houses, and therefore he changed them to something which was rather strange. Then we come to the question that we are looking at today, which is actually an iceberg, which is an elephant, sorry, a lion rock, which is very, very important. And it's actually, it's a it is a granite rock containing proportions of quartz, and it rises about 600 feet above the sea level. Now, what is very interesting is that if you look at the singular alphabet, there is the waka, which is two. You have to twist your arm or your wrist in two directions to write the alphabet, which meant that the Sinhalese had to learn to roll their wrists, and that gave them, they became a very artistic people because they were able to twist their wrists and so on to do paintings and writings and also things like that. Then the other thing was, which was very important, was that they were highly curious people and very keen on observations. So every rock in the village had a name. So, for example, you have Atagala, which means elephant rock. You have Gommatagala, which is like a cowpat as a stone. Andagala is an eel-shaped rock, and so on. And then you have Sigiriya, which to me, I have a photograph I took in 1974. I am not showing that photograph here. I'm showing a sketch of it because it's coming in a book that I'm working on at the moment. It has a distinctive shape of a lion when seen from a distance. So the concept that I have is that it was totally unnecessary to build a lion, as some scholars have illustrated, but because the form of the crouching lion was visible in plain sight, and it could be seen as you walked around. And this is actually a tracing of the photograph, which shows you the lion. And it's a very distinct lion, because you can see its face, eyes, the mouth, and so on. You can see the manes, and then you have the rest of the lion. And this actually stands out over the forest canopy. So it's very, very interesting. So to me, there was no necessity to build a lion because the lion was existing there. But the story becomes slightly more complicated here, because the Mahavihara scribes of the when they wrote the Mahavansa, they were actually angry with Kasyapa. So they said Kasyapa is a wicked king because he killed his father, and therefore he ran away to Sigiriya, and he built a palace and a garden and so on, and he wanted to live like King Quera, now as a god king, So that's basically the whole story. Actually, the known story, or the story that you will be told when you go to the garden, if you go to Sigiriya today, that's the story that you will be told. And this statement has been accepted by a lot of people, actually. However, there has been some confusion as to whether there was a palace on the top of the rock or what. And for example, Bell in 1895 talks about the very strong driving monsoon winds, which almost like a gale, And therefore, then there's Raja de Silva again talks about the strong winds. So one wonders actually whether it was possible to ever build anything. So a building on top of the rock, because the wind was so strong and it took the full blast of the monsoon. So what happened was that the structures on the top, though Parinithan and all said they were palaces, they were not palaces, but it was a brick formation which was able to take the full blast of the annual rains of the northeast monsoon, and then channel that into the ponds that were at the bottom. Now, if you look at the overall feeling of Sigiriya, you find that you have the Eiselberg, and then the rest of it slopes away. Now, what is very interesting is that the original earth that covered the Eiselberg has now been, over millions of years, been settled down, and it forms the plain and the jungle around the rock itself. Now, the Mahavansa, which was written by the scribes of the Mahavihara, also refers to it as a fortress. But there was an interesting incident that took place when Chow Lai came to Sri Lanka, and he was taken to Sigiriya, and he was told that Sigiriya is actually a fortress. And he, as a guerrilla leader, I mean, you can see his mind going in different directions. And he just looked and said, he must be a fool, because all you have to do is just surround it, and you can starve everybody to death. So we also don't believe that it was ever a fortress, because it hasn't got the makeup of a fortress. Then, for example, the question whether Kasyapa ever ruled in Sigiriya. He was king for 18 years. But one thing is that had he moved from Anuradhapura to Sigiriya, somebody else would have taken over Sigiriya, and that would have not been very good for him. So basically, I don't think he was foolish to go out of Sigiriya. He actually ruled in Anuradhapura and used Sigiriya only for his leisure. And a very interesting point here is that the Darada Maligava, or the house of the sacred tooth relic, which was in Anuradhapura, because the king, it's a Palladian of singular royalty, and the king was responsible for its protection, and he had to safeguard it. And it was actually in the Darada Maligava in Anuradhapura, the capital. Now, there is no mention anywhere that it was ever taken out of Anuradhapura during this period. Now, if Kasyapa moved away from Anuradhapura to Sigiriya, he would have taken the sacred tooth relic with him. But there is no mention of it anywhere, because we have mentioned, for example, when the capital shifted to different areas, of the king taking the relic with them and building special houses for it and so on, and especially within the precincts of their own palaces or somewhere close by. So it's a different story altogether. Now, if you look at some of the earlier people who worked on it, most people went on this Mahavansa record that it was a fortress, it was a palace, it was a mythical city of Quera, and Kasyapa lived there like Quera, the god of wealth, and so on, that he lived in Sigiriya. Now, it is very difficult to understand this godkin theory, because Parinithana also started creating garden layouts and all, where he thought that actually that's how it should have been. Then you have historians like Codrington and Mendes, who also accepted this Mahavansa theory and say that he lived in a palace on top of Sigiriya. Now, we have been made to understand that you can't build anything on top of the rock, because the wind was so strong that it is not possible. But for example, again, one of the last people to work on Sigiriya, that was Bandaranayaka, also went on the Mahavansa record, and supporting Bell and Parinithana's assertion that the summit housed the palace and the pleasure gardens and all sorts of things. And he also added a little more confusion to that, where he said there's a possibility of a huge lion depicted as a large sculpture on the face of the rock. Now, it was not, I don't think it was ever possible like that. And based on those theories, you have various people, especially in the tourist trade or contemporary filmmakers and so on, who extended their imagination beyond expectations, and they went into town. And these are some of the ideas that they made into their films, which comes out as a totally different story. And this is the depiction that they have of what Sigiriya was like, and so on. A lion, some had this whole rock made like a lion, and so on, and some as a half lion, whatever it is. So this was another stage that it went to. Then the other interesting thing about Sigiriya is that there are lots of paintings. Now, the paintings on the walls, there are various theories. Now, say, for example, Raja de Silva refers to Sigiriya not as the abode of Kasyapa, but actually as a Buddhist monastery. He said it's It's a Mahayana monastery, and so on. And basically, the pictures, the paintings that he saw on the walls, he said they're actually pictures of Tara, a bodhisattva, and so on. And that was the theory that he was running on. Now, the interesting thing is that what he was trying to say was that the, though there were lots of paintings, the painting was to be seen both by eyes and mind. So it's not in one, not in a certain direction. Then there's also the mirror wall that you see, which is very interesting, and I'll come to that later on in my discussion. It refers to there are graffiti on it, which refers to paintings on the summit, and most of the visitors who visited Sigiriya were from the 8th and 10th centuries, and they recorded seeing innumerable paintings on the rock surface, and some went into the extent of saying, "Don't touch the paintings," and so on. Now, Parinithana interprets the female figures as celestial beings or goddesses associated with natural phenomena, associated with clouds and lightning, and so on and so forth. Whereas Sri Gunasinghe, who wrote the last bit on Sigiriya, says that actually they were only they were just imitations and so on, and it had a different story altogether, which is also interesting. Then the other thing that is interesting about Sigiriya, or very sad about Sigiriya, is that the ramp that we are looking at is, we only see the ramp on the western side, right? Now, there was a ramp on the eastern side as well, from the northeast coming up along the eastern flank and coming into the Lion's Paw. Now, that is buried. It has not been uncovered. It has never been uncovered. And little or no excavation has been conducted on the eastern side of the rock. Now, if one is to appreciate Sigiriya as a complete holistic entity, then the eastern side to me is very important. Now, Raja talks about this, his sort of his Sigiriya and the abode of Tara and various things like that. And of course, there are lots of people who have contested that, and so on. And we go from that. Then, for example, sorry, I seem to be going all over again. So, as far as Gunasinghe is concerned, he said they were actually paintings of beautiful women who add to the glamour of palaces and mansions in the city. And the poets so fondly write about it, because a lot of poetry is written about the women, their shapes, their eyes forms, and so on and so forth. And he sort of refers to it slightly differently, and which is as a visual record of beauty, which I think is very interesting. And also the fact that all the figures face Anuradhapura, almost begging or beckoning Kasyapa to come to Sigiriya. Now, so this is actually where my real story starts, because it's actually, I'm looking at it from a quite a different point of view, from an architecture, archaeology, landscape theory, and so on, to see whether there's a broader scope in this whole concept, and also the fact that the Buddhist concept has always revolved around a great respect for nature, and this humility is seen actually in the execution of Sigiriya. If you look at Sigiriya very differently from the stories that people tell you, and the interpretation that you will be exposed to if you go to the site, was very different actually. The fact that Kasyapa still ruled in Anuradhapura as the king of the island, and then he used Sigiriya for simple relaxation and so on. Now, the leisure was not having great fun, but in meditation, focusing, mind adjustment, and contemplation, and so on. And reflecting on the wrong he had done, because he had killed his father. So, or the story goes that he killed the story, but there's another part of that which I won't go into. And also the fact that his half brother Mogalanna, who ran off to India, would come back one day to take revenge on Kasyapa. Now, This is the picture that you would see mostly in all the brochures and so on. I showed you a totally different thing. Now, what is very interesting is that if you go to Sigiriya at 5 o'clock in the morning, the mist rises and envelopes the Sigiriya plain. Okay? And if you look at it very carefully, you find that the mist goes right up to the fresco pocket. So there is no situation where the paintings are actually, to me, the ladies are actually floating on the morning mist. And it's an unforgettable sight if one is inclined to visit the site early in the morning, because you see this mist at 5 o'clock in the morning rising up to the fresco pocket, not covering the ladies, but on the lower level. Now, for example, Bell, writing in 1895, considered the clouds only as a device to overcome the obstacle of a concave rock surface. The clouds show that they were in the heaven or in the sky or whatever it is. So were they really apsaras, or, as we believe, playful minds using what is there to record some faces and illustrate an illusion when viewed from afar? Now that's something that I would look at. Then due to the isolation, it is very important to correct rainwater at Sigiriya. So what you see as depicted as a palace here is not a palace, but that's a extensive walling structure which took the full blast of the northeast monsoon and collected the water in these ponds. So in other words, it was a buffer to collect the water and take it into the ponds. Sorry. Then on the eastern face of that complex is the granite throne, and that is again very interesting because it had post holes for timber posts, and on top would have been a cloth veneer, a cloth hung over it to give shade from the strong wind. Now you see the same thing in the audience hall at the lower picture, where, for example, the same type of attitude towards creation of the throne is there, and that's where they had their meetings. Now, one of the I spoke about this slightly in the earlier phase, where we were talking about a seam or a boundary. Now, the seema at Sigiriya was a water boundary, so it actually was a moat which went round, and the earth which was excavated from the moat was used for the bricks. Now, what is important about this seema or this isolation in this huge parkland is that it becomes an inner habitable space, which is controlled by this moat in this case, right? And the moat is separated from the complex, from the jungle and the herds of elephants that came quite close, drawn by the smell of the tame ones in the stables and so on. Now, another thing that worried me was actually this so-called axis, because people are talking about an axis from the west. Now, traditionally, we have a problem because no entrances are to the west. It's either to the north, east, or south. So the western entrance, as I understand it, demarcates the path which is taken by Paranithana on his daily visits, extended for decades from his work campsite located in the open area to the west, connecting to the rock. Now, even in recent years, the Central Cultural Fund workforce still maintains this entrance as a direct access from the residential accommodation to the Eiselberg. Now, this misconceived concept of an axis cuts across walls to added new staircases and literally confuses what was originally there. Now, I will just give you an example here of a wall where, for example, sorry. Mahesh? Well, anyway, it's a photograph which was taken in 1920. 1920, which actually shows you what a formal entrance is like, which to me is very important, because we are looking at now this is a very small Padanangala, where we are looking at earlier one, where we are looking at an entrance. So there is a formality if a king or someone got involved in an entrance, which is something which is very important, right? Now we seem to be forgetting that, and when we look at Sigiriya, we see a lot of arbit. Now this is a very early picture of the Western monasteries and the entrance. So you can see there is a certain formality in the way entrances are done in the country. Now, as far as the Sigiriya is concerned, now this is the axis. It cuts across walls. If you look at the top left-hand side picture, it cuts across walls. It has no meaning whatsoever. Then you have the one at the bottom, which is actually the Western entrance. And that's the entrance all of you will take when you go to Sigiriya. It has no meaning at all. It looks as though somebody has done it very arbitrarily by just opening that wall and going into that and so on. So again, there is a little monastery complex here, which is in the middle of the jungle. Unfortunately, I don't have the other view, but you see the walls coming and turning in, and then you have this little entrance feature out here. So basically, all entrances had a certain formality. To me, this is totally arbitrary and has no meaning at all. Then as far as construction is concerned, because of the strong winds on the top of the rock, it is not possible to build anything up there. So you either have to come halfway down or come down to the ground level to do any buildings. Now this is a structure with rooms and a courtyard and so on. So halfway up the rock. Now, if you look at the residential areas, we have that axis actually has created some problems, in the sense that it has bifurcated some structures. When I look at it carefully, I find that there is an issue, in the sense that because there were actually three buildings. One building was situated in the middle of the so-called axis, and two others on either side, creating two courtyards on the two sides, right? And the courtyards, in my opinion, were housed the much talked about fountains, which you don't see very much of now, but you will see it in the near future. But basically, then there is also talk about a charbagh. Now, charbagh came to India in the 16th century, right, from Persia, brought by the Mughals. So it's very difficult to think that this concept existed in Sigiriya itself. Now, to give you an idea of what that is all about, this is the axis which cuts through walls and so on, and it comes down. So I'm saying there was a building here. That's a courtyard, and another building on either side, very much like this. And this is the courtyard, and this actually are the fountains. Fountains are connected to some tanks further up, closer to the rock, and underground conduits bring the water into this during the rain, and the fountain starts spurting out. So it's quite an interesting phenomena. But if it was in the open landscape, you wouldn't have even seen the fountains, because for example, there is no impact in the fountains at all. Whereas if it was in a courtyard, it would be almost stunning, because it's a confined space. There's a closeness and there's a visual connection and so on. So it's much more exciting than having it in the open. Then the other thing about Sri Lankan landscaping is that there's a very strong symbiotic relationship between work, right? So if walls go along and it meets a rock, it doesn't break the rock, but it goes against the rock and goes to the other side and continues on the other side. So this relationship, this sensitivity actually comes from that very early statements made in the fourth century, in the third century, by Devanampiya Tissa and so on, about the rock and various things there. Now, another thing that you encounter when you come to Sigiriya is that there are structures on the rock. Now, how are the structures anchored into the wall or onto the surface of the rock? They actually made indentations in the rock surface and then built the wall as closer to the edge as possible, because they wanted the natural form of the rock to be kept. And these are examples of the indentation that they made. And then the walls are built here right at the edge of the rock, so that they look as like part of the rock itself. Now here, for example, in the right hand bottom picture, you find that the same thing is happening, where the wall, for example, runs right at the edge. But to me, one of the more dangerous things that have happened recently is that they have been fixing sort of steel rods into the rock itself to anchor a new staircase. Now, to me, it is highly dangerous, because I don't know whether anybody has really tested the stratigraphy of this rock at that particular location, because steel will corrode, and when it corrodes, it will expand, and it could even push the whole of that site out, which could be quite a problem. Then the other one we will get through is the mirror wall, which is an interesting structure, and you will be told about it when you get to the site. It actually covers the side wall of the ramp. You have to remember that the people who came from Anuradhapura were plains dwellers. They are not people who are used to being on heights. So they had to be given some psychological security when they walked on these ramps. So the introduction of this mirror wall, which is normally built taller than average human, was also gave a certain shielding to the meme. It also shielded the people not only from being worried about the height, but it also shielded them from views from distance. So nobody really understood or nobody saw people walking on the sides of the ramps and so on. Now, what is very interesting is that the surface finish of the ramp, of the mirror wall, which was exposed to the elements, was made out of mixing fine clay, egg white, bees honey, and daul kirunu, that is the wild cinnamon, the juice of the wild cinnamon, and hydrated lime from freshwater snail shells. Now, these snails are very commonly available in all the freshwater streams in the island, and that mixture, when applied, would then harden and be polished using a smooth stone to develop a sheen. Now, for example, if you look at the graffiti that you will be shown when you come to the site, was when the graffiti was inscribed onto the mirror wall itself, on the layer. And you can see it here, for example, where this is one of the mirror walls, and that's the graffiti which was on the surface of the wall, and that's one of the mirror walls going this way. And you can see it's almost at the edge of the rock. So it looks as though it's part of the rock rather than something alien developed on that site. Then another interesting thing is that you have the lion's paw terrace. How do you get from the lion's paw to the top, right? So I looked at it very carefully, and I found indentations in the rock and so on. And I found that actually there was almost a vertical section into which a dog-leg staircase was fitted, so that people could actually walk up. And when they got to the flat level, they would then go according to they would go up here, and then behind the mirror wall, they would walk up to the top of the rock. So that's really the purpose of the pause that you see was to give it some sort of indication to the entrance of the staircase itself. Then we look at, for example, residential buildings. Now, one building which was very interesting on the lower level again was something that had been over excavated and so on. And it was gridded and excavated. So I would say over excavated. And on completion, the site features many squares laid out in an identifiable pattern with some pebbles interspaced between them and so on and so forth. It was called a water garden. I would contest that because it never was a water garden and so on. And then, for example, Professor Byron, and we had lots of discussions with him, and we produced a palace on those squares. In fact, it's very interesting because there are pebbles in between these squares, and if you have a thin layer of water, it's actually Tirivanagal, which are also almost crystals. They become prisms, and reflect sunlight in all sorts of directions and so on. And that to me was the purpose of the crystals, the Tirivanagal crystals that are laid in between these squares. So the squares were little pavilions. The sunlight striking the Tirivanagal would be taken in various directions and so on. And to me, it was not a water garden, but a palace complex. Now, it was again very interesting because later on, I was requested to do a priest accommodation at down south in Sri Lanka, right at the southernmost part of Sri Lanka. And I looked at it because I had a similar problem where, for example, it was a sloping site and rainwater was flowing down the site into a reservoir, into a river, right? So I couldn't do buildings which restricted the movement of the water. So I took my mind back to what was done at Sigiriya, and I thought maybe I should try something out like that. And I would like to present that to you. So these are the little pavilions connected by bridges, and this is the pebbles. So water would flow between that and go down to the tank. So this is a series of things like this. Earlier, the priests wanted handrails. I refused to do handrails for them, but now they got quite used to it, and handrails has not been a problem. Of course, when it rains, water goes in the courtyard. If you want more privacy, you could hang curtains along the edges of the thing. And that's possibly how Sigiriya worked, where you had a palace, you had pavilions, you had these pebbles reflecting light in also the directions. And when you wanted privacy, you had this Vienna or this curtain, which is hung on either side here to give you the privacy that you wanted. So that's a possibility, right? Now, what is also very interesting is that this whole concept, Sri Lankan landscape concept, is very different between the East and the West. Now, in the East, it is always done with great respect, working in harmony with and being subservient to nature, while in the West, it's always been man against nature, and man being the supreme being. So that's basically the story of that. And for example, as a country, of course, we lost out a lot because, say, during the colonial period, we had all our cloud forests destroyed by the British plantation enterprise. 14,000 elephants were killed in the process, and so on. And it was declared, because, for example, this was the country that declared the first natural forest, Uyana, or the first forest reserve in the 3rd century BC. So we have a lot to teach everybody else, but unfortunately, our new generations also have studied in colonial universities and therefore tend to carry a slightly different mindset. Then I would therefore like to conclude here by saying that the Mahavansa statement that Kashyapa was going to have a fortress, a palace, and a garden at Sigiriya is not very correct, and so on. And maybe it needs to be looked at differently. The northeastern entrance and the long ramp has not been looked at, and so on. So how can the holistic concept of Sigiriya ever be ascertained if over 70% of the site remains unexplored and hidden beneath the jungle? The story of Sigiriya is based on numerous assumptions and will always remain a figment of one's imagination. And the same could be said of Anuradhapura also, because we are still working on the areas that the British archaeologists had been working on, whereas a more important parallel development, the Ruhuna kingdom, which is contemporaneous to Anuradhapura or even older than Anuradhapura, is being totally neglected and remains covered in jungle. Now, how can one appreciate and understand the holistic history of this great island when much remains unexplored and regularly destroyed following undocumented human territorial expansion? Now, the Sigiriya, for example, as we know it, is a World Heritage Site with a recorded history going back to the 5th century. Originally a Theravada monastery, as recorded in the Mahavansa Tika, then it was converted according to the Mahavansa into a fortress, a palace complex, and a garden, all similar to another Alakamanda, which is the dwelling for the god Quera. The new additions, like the new museum and interpretation center, are being created to enhance and facilitate the requirements of a fickle tourist trade. This includes the provision of toilets, parking for vehicles, souvenir shops, snack bars, facilities for tour guides, hotels located within walking distance of the site, which can lead to visual pollution when viewed from the summit, as well as other amenities demanded by the tourists, further stretching the site's carrying capacity. The scale of the hotels and the pools of the hotels surrounding the site are a serious visual pollution instead of a thick green forest landscape. The vibrant blue of the swimming pools attached to the hotels screams at you when viewed from the summit. Now, Sigiriya is a special archaeological site which has been converted into an international museum. This museum, this to me, will finally lead to its destruction. It will lose all its heritage values, including its inherent symbolic value. I wish to thank IFLA for this opportunity to make this presentation, and also to the Sri Lanka branch for their courage in allowing me to make this rather controversial presentation to you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deshamana Vidya Jyoti, architect Ashley Divas, for that very mysterious and amazing version. Is there another version, a story for Sigiriya? And I think after your presentation, we all have to agree that there is another version. And from now, we move on to our next speaker, a scholar who has devoted most of her life to this project in Anuradhapura, and architect and landscape architecture in Amendra, for your fascinating story of enhancing the palimpsest in historical religious landscape with reference to the sacred city of Anuradhapura. And we move 70 kilometers from the other side that architect Ashley was talking about. Over to you, Shireen.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Thank you. So I will, without much ado, I will go to my presentation, and I hope you can see my screen. Okay. Yeah. Yes, I hope you all can all hear me very well.
Yes, very well, Shireen.
Yes. And can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can.
Right. So thank you very much, Shirani, for the introduction. And I will go on to my title, which is Enhancing the Palimpsest in Historic Religious Landscape with reference to the sacred city area of Anuradhapura. So thank you to the President and
Sorry, before you
Council.
continue, can you click on the hide button? Do you see a panel that says hide? StreamYard is sharing your screen, and then there's
Yes,
a button that says hide. Can you click on hide?
on high. Uh, yes, okay. Will do.
Yes, all good now. Thank you.
Okay, so that is my title. Thank you very much. And if I can just move on, I must say thank you to IFLA APR and thank you to the President and Council of IFLA for hosting this event and for having me on this, and of course all the members who are present here today. I must also thank Mr. Sajid Amendra who did the 3D graphic modeling for this research in 2006. Sri Lanka is a verdant island in the Indian Ocean, a maritime hub with many heritage sites. You can see these 8 sites which are recognized for their cultural and natural significance, showcasing the rich and diverse heritage of Sri Lanka. Anuradhapura was a vibrant trading emporium situated between the two busy ports of Mahatitta on the west and Gokarna in the east. And not least in the north was Jambukolapatana in the north. Rich and royal Anuradhapura was the capital of the land of lakes and agriculture, the Vaubali Rajya of the Nuara Kalavia, a land of plentiful supply, which is known as Subiksha. So it is not just the lake, but a vibrant culture. As the thunderclouds gather, the area is prone to many lightning strikes, which break the strong nitrogen bonds, allowing combination with the monsoon rain through oxides and nitrates towards the formation of a fertile soil. The lakes were observed by Robert Knox as not natural but made by art. Those were ancient landscape interventions. The sacred city of Anuradhapura was established around 4th century BCE by a succession of kings with a city, parks, gardens, and monumental structures, with Buddhism having royal patronage. The sacred city was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1982 with recognized legal status. The United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, and with its World Heritage Sites, WHS, are sites designated to have a significant cultural and natural heritage and are considered to be of outstanding value to humanity. It's known as OUV, Outstanding Universal Value. Anuradhapura is administered by many authorities, with the sacred area being one of its divisions. The World Heritage System requires states and parties to engage in the management of cultural properties, as this is to do with heritage management. It's in two different and significant stages which form a continuum. A state party must first demonstrate, as part of the inscription process, how it will manage the OUV of a property. And by having the existence of a management plan or other management system. And after inscription, a state party must respect its commitment to safeguarding the OUV of the property through effective long term management, which allow this protection to be verified. There is a resource manual, and within the which is a guide to management, and within which all the various paths is the operational guidelines. So UNESCO has various advisory bodies. One is ICROM, ICOMOS, IUCN. These, I think, need no introduction to you. However, IFLA has not had a direct link to UNESCO, but operates through the ICOMOS, as I understand. And the advisory bodies on landscape heritage management in Sri Lanka, we have the Urban Development Authority for most of the master plans, as well as some uh, landscape management plans. They are advised by the Department of Archaeology and the Central Cultural Fund. Further overseen by the National Physical Planning Department is the Sacred Area Development Committee. It used to be called the Atamasthana Committee, which is the area of 8 sites, but it is now called by this name, and there's representation from the various stakeholders as well as the UDA. I understand there's funding from France now for some projects such as car parks. The Prime Minister of Sri Lanka recently attended the International Expert Conference on an integrated and sustainable approach to safeguarding the World Heritage property of the sacred city of Anuradhapura in Sri Lanka. And significantly, I would add, an associated living heritage, which was held in Paris. The Minister of Buddha Sasana, Religious and Cultural Affairs, presented the integrated management plan of the government of Sri Lanka towards a sustainable and integrated management of the sacred city of Anuradhapura. Given the ensemble of Anuradhapura sacred city and surrounds, it is imperative that the entirety should be considered rather than separated entities. For this, we must understand the palimpsest, that is, this Anuradhapura sacred area. There is much on YouTube and so on if you want a tourist view, but here we will consider the landscape of the sacred area, the peripheral landscape as considered as a buffer zone, the stupa structures and many other structures of archaeological value embedded in the landscape, outstanding ancient technology, the continuing intangible heritage of the ritual use of the sacred area by the people. A former director general of UNESCO has observed that without the understanding and support of the public at large, without the respect and daily care of the local communities, who are the true custodians of world heritage, no amount of funds or army of experts will suffice in protecting the sites. So we look at these various areas. As a royal city and established with water ponds, they are known as Vapi in Pali, parks and gardens by the kings Pandukabir, who reigned 377 to 307 BCE, and son Muttasiva, 307 to 247 BCE, was when these ancient parks and gardens were laid out. The later king Devanampiyatissa, in 247 to 207 BCE, had a close stately relationship with King Ashoka of India. The son of King Ashoka, the Arahant Mahinda, arrived as an emissary by air to encounter the king hunting in the royal forests, that is on the east side here. And those were the forests where the king used to go periodically. So, asking the pertinent question from the king about mango trees and testing the king's intelligence, and then being satisfied, having preached the doctrine of the Buddha, was thereafter escorted by the king to stately Anuradhapura, to the city. Arahant Mahinda settled in the parkland named the Grove of the Great Cloud, Mahamegavan. Arahant Mahinda consecrated 8 sites. And in those 8 sites were the park itself and the site where the tree of enlightenment, the Bodhi tree, It's called the Bodhi tree or Sri Mahabodhi, was established. Later, it would be planted and the place worthy of a stupa. Now it says stupa here. Stupa is in Pali, stupa in Sanskrit, and so on. So thereafter, King Ashoka sent his daughter Sanghamitra as an emissary, bringing a sacred branch of the Bodhi tree in Buddha India, and established the sacred sapling on the upper terrace, known even today as the Udamaluva, south of the city of Anuradhapura at the edge of the gardens. It was customary then to plant trees on platforms called Malaka, now known as Malua in Sinhalese. These gardens and parks were all managed by Vatupalaka or park attendants, all this in times BCE. The consecrated place for the stupa was exceedingly special. And here I have shown the site actually, which was visited by 4 Buddhas, and this table I have compiled from the Mahavansa or the Great Chronicle. Because my narrative, researchers, and presentations are sourced from many texts, presented at many fora, and also sourced primarily from the Mahavansa, which is the Great Chronicle of Lanka. And it was known as the Great Chronicle of Ceylon, or now Great Chronicle of Sri Lanka, but Lanka was the name applied then. And of course, also the manuals of skill sets or Silpa Sastras, particularly that of Manjusri, among a plethora of other works. These were known in times BCE, but put down in writing much later. We come to the peripheral landscape, which is considered as a buffer zone now in management terms. The landscape typologies are in these earlier said 5th century writings. Among these are ancient landscapes with 4 excellent types of landscape for building stupas: the Anupa, Jangala, Dhumraka, and Sadarana. The landscape character is somewhat described, and these I depict through my more recent images of the landscape extant. So there were trees and parkland, it's described in the manuals, but this is probably what it looked like. A popular song of the 1930s with a lilting melody, that is Dano Budunge, for those who know the Sri Lankan song. It portrays the sanctity, culture, and landscape of Anuradhapura at its peak stage in ancient times. The landscape of lotus, this is the play, the landscape of lotus and lily-filled ponds, abundant with ducks and wildfowl, is depicted as the 3 Lambakanna friends approach Anuradhapura, further describing the sacredness of this great city, the abode of monks of virtue. This play is based on the story found in the 36th chapter of the Mahavansa, which is about these friends, Sirisangabo and his 2 friends, Gotabaya and Sangatissa, who, having served royalty, ultimately reigned as the few last kings of the Anuradhapura period from 243 CE to 262 CE. So this is how they would have seen the landscape of the stupas overtopping the verdant canopy of trees, and at that time they had no pinnacles. They were topped by the umbrella of sovereignty, which was symbolic, aesthetic, cultural, functional, and technical, shown here as likely in ancient times. So there was a chhatra, a kind of a disc, and what I have shown here is, according to my reconstruction of the design, the copper foil draping over the dome. So there were many other structures, stupas and structures in Anuradhapura. The present city shows a similar scenario, somewhat less verdant, but with the stupas topped by the pinnacle spire, which was a development of the chhatra as a series of several such discs. The chhatra is essentially a disc. The palimpsest of the landscape can be seen today as shown here, with the first and oldest stupa, which was the diminutive Tuparama, embedded in the treescape, and the three great stupas, Mirisavati, Ruvanvelisaya, and Abhayagiri, breaking the canopy of the trees. The Jetavana of the Jetavana Ramaya was built at a later date by King Mahasen. There were many other stupas as well. We see in today's landscape the Ruvanvelisaya, set in its very particular parkland site. The stupas of the Uttaravihara or northern temple, these are the Abhayagiri, the Lankarama, the Jetavana all built spanning around 500 years. After the British colonization, these 8 places consecrated by Yaran Mahinda were revised to protect all these sacred places from destruction. The stupas, although generally domiciled in form, have a variety of shapes and monumental size as depicted in these graphics shown in 2006 by Sajita Mendra for my research work. They were monolithic and axially symmetrical on various axes. They were among the largest brick structures in the world, with being over 100 meters in height. A cutaway view depicts the various parts of the stupa and the terms applied in different languages here. As I said, stupa, tupa, dagaba, dagoba, chaitya are all different, refer to the same item in different languages. The structure had its own proportions and symbolism, but for one unique stupa, the landscape and siting was very special. It was ordained to be built on a specific site, as I showed earlier, and it was ordained to be built at the demise of the Buddha, which was in centuries past. And it was said such that Buddha's relics shall come to be enshrined in the great stupa on the island of Lanka. Sited in an Anupa type landscape, by a pond, the Kahuda Vapi, which was filled in by a later king, King Lanjatissa, to create the sacred walkway. The site was central on the axis between the Sri Mahabodhi tree, the tree of enlightenment, and the Tuparama, the first stupa in Anuradhapura. Now, there was at that time, in times BCE, outstanding ancient technology. I will not go into too much detail, but I'll show you the tip of the iceberg and touch on only one aspect of the very many technologies known at that time. Humans have always marveled at natural phenomena, the clouds and so on. Perhaps the Arahant priests who directed the building of the stupas were well aware of the electrical potential and possible damage to the 100-meter plus tallest stupas. Lightning occurs in microseconds, dissipating a current in the order of kiloamperes. In the present form, with a pinnacle, the stupa is protected with a down conductor type of system. You can see it here on the edge of this corner. The ancient, ingenious design of the umbrella of sovereignty, which was symbolic, aesthetic, cultural, was also notably functional and technical. My research and presentations reconstructed this early system to make it known. The diagram here shows the copper foil of my reconstruction draping over the onto the dome here shown, and confirmation of the existence of such a disc arrangement is borne out by the Sanchi Stupa in India, having a Chatravali or disc upon a disc, which was called Chatta in Sri Lanka. I had 3 models, of which only one is shown here to indicate the principle. This was a technology applied in ancient times, perhaps around the 3rd century BCE to around the 11th century CE, and maintained by the many kings that followed, as mentioned in the Mahavansa. This was not a conductor, but a lightning arrestor and a dissipator, As the charged clouds came over, using the early streamer emission system and dissipating over voltages with the crystal ring or Vajra Chumbata functioning as a corona discharge ring. The system was reconstructed in my research and shown to the world, which electrical engineers are trying to understand, albeit with one company winning awards for a modern version of what I have shown here. So by the time this current comes down to the ground, it is harmless because of the high impedance of the dome. But although I have shown this model, I actually favor this model, which actually shows the copper foil rising from the base. And this all this technology is shown in these ancient Silpasastras. And copper was the element that carried through the big posts to the thinner posts to the top. The chatra upon a chatra, as I said, chatra to chatra, or disc upon a disc, evolved into today's Kotkaralla or pinnacle spire during the Polonnaruwa period when Anuradhapura fell to decay and the capital shifted. So all this was shown in this earlier research presentation done elsewhere and much more. Yet another research done in the 1990s, long ago, shows how it led to the model for synergistic design, which presents a landscape as a connected set of parameters, depicted by the form of a tetrahedron, which is wholly an interconnected model. Every corner, every entity is related to every other entity. So one can see a landscape at any point of time, and I call it the SAM eco model after Sri Namendra's ecological model due to the connections. Now, this, if I take it for Anuradhapura, it will it can be a model which can move temporally through time, through from the 7th century BC to the present time, and that's the timeline. But if the landscape would then go through a series of changes from natural to parks and gardens or the city, and then the sacred city, and then development occurs in ancient times, and thereafter about 10 or 11 centuries the abandoned comes about, and it was clothed in jungle once again. And then of course another so many 10 centuries later the British finds it under the jungle and clears it, and now we have developed to the present time with the commercial city on the southwest. But there is a tendency now, and in 1949 with the Anuradhapura plan, to revert to this sacred city and its pristine state. So back to the existing remains of stupas and the elements in the landscape, which would form the overall palimpsest. This is how the British found Anuradhapura at the time of their discovery, and this tumulus was covered in jungle and cleared, and this is how you see it today. Now, even though royal patronage withdrew from Anuradhapura as the capital shifted, the people never forgot Anuradhapura. They came to pay homage and fulfill the traditional rituals, although they did not have the capacity to maintain the structures which fell into decay and dereliction. The sacred city of Anuradhapura had some notable events, from abandoned around 993 CE to Anuradhapura's preservation plan in 1949. There were aberrations in the sacred landscape. The first one of ancient times, the Jetavana Stupa, was built in the sphere of influence of the Mahatupa, as it was known and known today as Ruanvelisaya or Swarnamali Chaitya. It also impeded the access to the east, which was the first aberration. And then when the British found the city, the old artifacts were still there, but the open space, clearing the jungle and finding open space, there was development of the residential quarters of the British and churches, a school, market, a flower garden, and even a meat market right next to the Sri Mahabodhi, or the sacred tree of enlightenment. So the people who had not forgotten Anuradhapura protested with this person, Brahmachari Balisingha Harishchandra, saving Anuradhapura with total erasure of all that was there and a return to the palimpsest of the stupas. There was protest, trial, and acquittal of this person who saved Anuradhapura. The third aberration was a visual intrusion of a recently built stupa, causing an intrusion to the palimpsest landscape of ancient stupas of Anuradhapura. Now, the continuing intangible heritage and the ritual use is an important aspect of how the sacred area is to be used. There is a difference between heritage landscape and a living sacred heritage landscape. The people come as communities, entire villages, or small groups or individuals. Traditionally, after the month of Vesak, which is around May, celebrating the thrice blessed day of the birth, demise, and enlightenment of the Buddha, people flock to Anuradhapura to pay homage to the receptacle of the Buddha's remains as relics, which is embodied in the Mahatupa or Ruanvelisaya Stupa. And then, following ritualistic traditions, they move through the landscape to the main sacred features, the Bodhi tree and other stupas. Visiting public require facilitation, some degree of comfort for their preference, according to their preference. The motorized vehicles require parking facilities and, of course, preferably shaded. The lack of tree cover is evident. Is absolutely evident here. While the sacred rituals continue unchanged over the centuries, all done with a dignified manner with shraddha, a word, I think, fervor being the nearest translation. Shade and facilitation for barefoot ritualistic walking, particularly along the sacred walkway, is considered but not always successful. So, tree platforms or malaka were common in ancient Anuradhapura. The most sacred platform being the Udamaluva of the Sri Mahabodhi, the sacred Vicus religiosa. The palimpsest vestiges of platforms, the ancient malaka on which trees were planted, are becoming somewhat erased. Neglect of this land forming has occurred in recent times. So, enhancing the palimpsest. Should design move forward with modern materials and changes, or should tradition and rituals be respected? The traditions and rituals have not changed they have been unchanging over the centuries. It makes it imperative that the landscape should revert to that which would accommodate these practices. Enhancing the shade characteristic with trees, respectfully planted on low malakas as in ancient times, and so on, but there has to be some degree of facilitation, but not over facilitated. So, the way forward, I think we have to have for heritage landscapes, landscape architects should be coming to the fore, understanding the sacred landscape, the ambience, the spirituality, understanding the ritual practices, the dignity and calm, and respecting the process of within a sacred landscape, the paths and the purity, and so on, using materials which are conducive, cool, earthy, rustic materials, and so on. So, we have to have a landscape management team for regular inspection and monitoring of facilities and formulate strategies and actions for this ritual use and set goals for achieving landscapes of spirituality. So many aspects are to be considered and have been considered. Heritage landscape management, not just heritage management, but landscape management should be seen as an ensemble rather than separated entities. Recognition of the particularity of the site and the landscape, and of course, state patronage for the protection has to be there, which is already there. The continuous living legacy of pilgrims and homage has to be recognized with facilitation in a manner sensitive to the sanctity and rituals. The carrying capacity should be primarily for the people and then for the experience of visitors. Adding appropriate tree cover for shade and thermal comfort, and of course, recognition that Anuradhapura is not merely a tourist or heritage site alone, and that landscape management of this sacred place must be done for its sacred value. So, in conclusion, the sacred area of Anuradhapura and its environs must essentially be considered as an ensemble of the landscape. By marveling at specific aspects such as the monumentality of the stupas or the technical expertise of building, irrigation, or landscape interventions, heritage management and heritage landscape management should be considered as an ensemble of collective entities primarily for the people to experience, as is their tradition, merely a heritage city, but a living sacred heritage city to be managed accordingly. And I believe that this is what any tourist or any visitor would like to see and experience. So, thank you very much, Slila and IFLA APR, for giving me this opportunity and all present at this talk. I have several references, many, many more, but I've just put in a few here. So I thank you very much.
Thank you, Shereen, for taking us through this journey of Anuradhapura, the palimpsest, and thoroughly understanding the value of intangible heritage and that it is a living city for the people and the need for the community to be involved in such a spiritual city like the ancient city of Anuradhapura. So now we move on to questions. So each of you also could ask each other questions because I'm sure Sherin and Ashley also would like to share some views. It's open to the audience. I can read the questions. Are there any questions from the participants? Well, I think it's been so mysterious and so unusually interesting and different to any of what has been going on at the conference. At the moment, there has not been any questions. I have a question for you, Ashley. Ashley, there was a recent article about the moats around Sigiriya and the water level and how it is ensuring that the water fountains would work. So what I understand is that it has been said that the water in the moats are enabling the water fountains. Can we have your indication of what you think of it?
Yeah.
Disregard the water fountains.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we
Okay.
can.
Basically, the moat has nothing to do with the water fountains. There is a pond closer to the base of the rock, if you would have seen, which is connected, and the conduits that brought the water to the fountain are conduits that are fitted into each other, like that. And I remember the first excavation which was done in that area, and the water came through that from that pond through these conduits to the fountain. It had nothing to do with the moat, because the moat is a much lower level. This pond is at a higher level, and you must be knowing that pond. Actually, it's just before you start climbing. On the left hand side there is a big rock, and it's at the base of that rock. Then from there you have these conduits, clay conduits, fitted into each other like this, which came all the way to the fountains. So there is no relation whatsoever between the moat and the fountains.
Okay, thank you, Ashley. And Sherin, I have a question for you. I'm fascinated by the platforms that were there for the trees And I was just wondering why landscape architects do not carry on this concept of having a platform where space is available for the planting of trees. Any indications from you?
Yes, some of the platforms are still evident, but they are eroding away. Can you hear me?
Yes, I
Can
can.
you hear me? Yes.
Yes, we
So,
can.
although the main platform is for the Sri Mahabodhi, which is still called the Uda Maluva, which means Maluva means Malaka. Malaka is a Pali word, Maluva is in Sinhala. And the idea of having platforms came from earlier, uh, philosophy which was practiced before Buddhism came in, but it was continued. And the trees were, even if you go to Anuradhapura today, you will see them slightly raised above the surrounding ground. This is not due to excavation, but that's the way they were. So this is getting eroded due to misunderstanding, and we should continue this if possible with grassed areas around, because it creates a lovely space for people to sit under and so on.
Thank you, Sherry. And since we are a little short of time, I would like to conclude. Uh, First, thanking the two speakers and the Institute of Sri Lanka Institute of Landscape Architects and IFLA for giving us this opportunity. Just to summarize on what um, landscape architect and architect Ashley was told us about Sigiriya. It's a really a fascinating journey that Ashley has taken. He spent, I think, almost his lifetime studying and questioning what the early archaeologists had said about Sigiriya. Um, and what was interesting about his understanding about the Eastern concept of landscaping compared to Western concept, how it's a nature-based solution even from times of the past. And what, as young landscape architects in our institute and in our audience, what we should understand is that that is what we should maybe look out for rather than trying to go against nature. And he specifically mentioned the two different strong concepts, the Western concept and the Eastern concept. He also spoke of fascinating stories about Sigiriya because we all had our own interpretations, maybe from the Mahavansa or maybe from archaeologists like Bell and Parnavitana and Bandaranaike. But now we have Ashley DeVos's um, understanding of Sigiriya. And I'm afraid I'm now believing in Ashley's version because he was able to tell us why, because of the northeast monsoon, it was not possible to have a palace, and it was all about collection of water. He also spoke about the axis that sometimes we speak to the students about, this vertical axis, with symmetry in Sigiriya, which is, according to Ashley, a misconception. And it was not the entrance that was there initially. And the beautiful courtyards that are there with the water fountains. Because, as he said, there's no point having tiny water fountains in a large landscape. I also remember the borrowed landscape that he spoke about when you go to the summit, and sadly, we see a lot of visual pollution. So, there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from this presentation. And as landscape architects, I think there's so much more that we should question and look out for in the way landscapes is managed, and we have interventions in the landscape, because it's very important that we preserve what we've got at the moment for the generations to come. Thank you, Ashley, for this very magical presentation of Sigiriya. And Shireen, you had done immense research and you told us the Anuradhapura sacred city, and that it is not only a sacred city but it's a living city, and the UNESCO guidelines, and how it's very important for the community to be involved in the protection of sacred landscapes. that it also is ritualistic, and in the month of Vesak, as most of you would see, the religious devotees would throng to Anuradhapura. It's become a ritual, annual ritual. They would go to Ruan Velisaya and then to see the Bodhi tree, and then, of course, the other stupas. And with the tourist pressure, we also have huge problem of management. It's same as Sigiriya, which has to be looked into. So I think, Shireen, you have analyzed and showed us the way, the aspects that we should look in for the management of a sacred landscape. Let's hope that the Sri Lankan authorities would be able to, with your support, do as much as we can so that we have a living landscape for the future. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Over to you, Champa. Well, I would like to invite all the participants to visit Sigiriya and visit Anuradhapura and see for yourself what these wonderful speakers have been talking to us. And if you have any questions, I'm sure our
There
institute
is
will be able to respond through the speakers.
there's a question in the comment box, I understand. Soban has said. Two questions.
There's currently two questions. If you want, we can just address that and then we can end the section.
Yes, perhaps I can answer the question,
Yeah,
what action
yeah.
are currently taken to care and protect these sites. As I showed that there were many entities advising advisory bodies in Anuradhapura, and it is a declared heritage site by UNESCO as among one of 8, which I showed right at the beginning of my presentation. However, there are so many authorities that it is hard to really tell anyone exactly what to do. There should be a strong representation of landscape architects to be able to really allow management to occur. So at the moment, there's the various government departments who are regulating, have particular regulations. They're protected under law. The next question, I wonder
Can I just come once into
what
that?
is done. So,
Sorry. May I, Shirani?
Yes, yes, of course, Ashley.
Uh, to me, one of the biggest problems in Anuradhapura is the fact that there was this Mahavihar, okay, and all the stupas and the monasteries were within this Seema, okay. Now, what has happened is that each of them have been given to different priests, right? And what is happening is that each priest wants to be its own dictator. So they're demanding things like uh, pilgrim dress, they're demanding things like car parks, uh, they're demanding things like uh, priest houses and so on. But that would eventually destroy the whole Seema of the Mahavihara. So, what is the solution to that? I mean, to me, all all pilgrimages should be in one location outside. The, all the other things, everything should be outside, so that we can still keep the old Seema. Otherwise, in another 5 years, somebody will ask you, what did Arahat mind the layout here? You wouldn't know. They can be completely destroyed. So I think this is an area that should be looked at very carefully. and a master plan worked out for Anuradhapura, that we can protect these sacred boundaries. I think this is very important actually.
Yes, if I may come in, I would somewhat disagree because the Mahavihara were the first, recipients of the Mahamega, the Uyana, as well as the whole area. And the first dispute came from the Jetavana and the Jetavana Ramaya. That was in historic times, and that was the first aberration that I showed. But it is a living landscape, and one cannot, separate the place from the people, and it's a people's landscape. What should be done? There is a master plan, and there is a master landscape management plan, which is already operative, which is already in place, but perhaps not operative. And it's the people who have to really be, looked at and then educated. There are the three viharas, and that is how the entire city moved to Polonnaruwa. And King Parakramabahu, who really brought back, restored some kind of unity among the various viharas at that time. So there were disputes, and those disputes were resolved. And that can be done even today with the help of landscape architects, with the help of the people, and understanding. And it has to be a deep understanding. I think that is important. They're not archaeological entities, they are not other entities, but it has to be seen as an ensemble. So, yes, people do have their views. Was there another question, Shirani, or was
Well, I can't see anything
it's the
else.
same? It's the same, isn't it? Yeah,
Yeah.
control
Um,
and Borobudur, yes.
yeah, maybe we can sum up then. And thank you again for those wonderful presentations and for giving us a new insight into Sigiriya and Anuradhapura. And we would definitely like all our participants to visit these places, or if there's any questions, to contact the institute of our institute, and then our speakers would uh, personally attend to the answers.
Thank you, Champa. Thank you, Sleela, and IFLA APR.
Thank you.